the arm thing here, I don't know. Every time I show up on TV, I wonder if I'm going to get a package from Rush Limbaugh with some OxyContin. But I think he's upset with me because A, I've beat him in the ratings in 2 different cities, and B, I call my program Biography Your Brain, you know, and that seems to offend him. Anyway, well, it does not lead to stiff thinking, however. Ed asked me to talk briefly about Citizens United, and in part because I wrote a book about it that John just mentioned, and in part because it's really one of the seminal issues of our day, and it's part of, for example, the problem that Russ Feingold is facing, that was mentioned in the very beginning here, that McCain-Feingold originally put limitations on the ability of people to self-finance their elections. Those got knocked down by the Supreme Court 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, and then it also put limits on corporate participation in politics, and that of course got knocked down in January this year, the Citizens United decision. But there's a couple of things that most people don't realize, and it's really important as just like sort of foundational civics 101, that I just want to lay this stuff out. I know a lot of you who listen to the program may know this, but it bears repeating in a relatively short and tight form so that you can share it with others as well. The first is that of the 3 branches of government, the legislative, the House and the Senate, the executive, the president, and all those offices that are, you know, the part of the cabinet and all that, and the judiciary, the Supreme Court at the head of that, the judiciary is actually far and away the most powerful. Now, this was not the intent of the founders. There is nothing in the Constitution of the United States that says that the Supreme Court has the power or even the right to tell Congress that a law that they passed, to tell the President that a bill that he signed into law is not consistent with the Constitution and has to be knocked down. Nothing. John Adams in 1800, when he lost the election of 1800, is referred to as the Revolution of 1800. In fact, there were people who were afraid he was going to refuse to leave office. He was such a crotchety, curmudgeony conservative. And he hated Thomas Jefferson at that point. They were not speaking to each other. Jefferson had been his vice president. On the day 2 years earlier when John Adams signed the Alien Sedition Act, Thomas Jefferson left town pointedly as a statement of protest. They had huge battles with each other. And so John Adams, on the last day of his presidency, as a final screw you to Thomas Jefferson, appointed Thomas Jefferson's most ardent political foe and third cousin, John Marshall, to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And for the next 20-some-odd years, John Marshall sat on the Supreme Court issuing all sorts of weird and bizarre opinions that radically reshaped America. And the first was in 1803. It was in a case called Marbury versus Madison, and in that case, Justice John Marshall, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled, decided, said that the court could take upon itself the power to liquidate, to eliminate, to destroy, to take off the books laws that have been passed by the Congress and the President, because the court, in its infinite wisdom, had decided that in some way they conflicted with the Constitution. A power, as I said, that was not in the Constitution. When this decision came down, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to his old friend, I'm forgetting his name, but he was the father-in-law of Patrick Henry, who was a dear friend of his, and he wrote a letter to him in which he said, if this decision is allowed to stand, the Constitution has become a felo de se, which is Latin for a suicide pact. He said, if this decision is allowed to stand, the judiciary will mold the Constitution like a thing of wax in its hands, and the will of the people will be lost for generations. He was right. And we have seen this over and over again. People say, oh, the Supreme Court, it's not all that important, it's not that big a deal. And what does this have to do with Democrats and Republicans in the White House? Well, let me get to that, let me explain this. In the 18-teens, the Supreme Court, there were, Teddy Roosevelt was, at least toward the end of his presidency, fairly progressive. And there were a lot of legislative efforts to do things like ban child labor. Now, certainly some of it was because adults didn't want them competing, but there was also a compassionate part of it. To ban child labor, to make the 50-hour work week was a rallying cry. We think 40 is a big deal. It was 50 back then, 50-hour work week. Time and a half for overtime, things like this. The Supreme Court ruled every single one of those things unconstitutional and knocked them down. Go back and look at the history of that era, the slaughterhouse cases and others, all these Supreme Court cases. And the Supreme Court has so much power that if tomorrow, the majority of the justices, 5 out of the 9 justices, if tomorrow 5 out of the 9 justices said You know, in the preamble of the Constitution, where it cites the 6 reasons why this Constitution was formed, and one of them says to promote the general welfare, it actually capitalizes general and capitalizes welfare, which was a way of, like, emphasizing them. For example, defense is not capitalized. It was literally their way of saying, this is more important than that. That when they said that, they included health care, and health care is a right and not a privilege, okay? If the Supreme Court said that tomorrow, it would be the law. Congress would have to pass a bill that would then give us national single-payer health care, and Tim Carpenter and I and everybody else, the Progressive Democrats of America, you know, we can take a nap. That's how powerful they are. And and people like don't get it. Now the Republicans got it. And back in the late 60s, early 70s, they created this thing called the Federalist Society. Now more than half of all judges in the United States are Federalist Society members. The Federalist Society is this right-wing indoctrination society that has a number of members on the Supreme Court that works to create basically right-wing judges, right-wing lawyers, right-wing, the whole thing. And John Roberts, a product of this, and like this. And so how do we get, given that the court system inappropriately and arguably illegally, I mean, you know, the Tea Partiers are like, oh, let's roll back the 17th Amendment, let's roll back the 10th Amendment, or not the 10th, the 21st, you know, I mean, they've got their list of things. I'd roll back Marbury versus Madison. You know, let's start at the beginning. But in any case, if